All right, we are in day 6 of our 6-day series. For just a second, just quickly kind of remember, we started with the conclusion of the ministry of Jesus in Galilee, his decision to, as Mark says, set his face to go to Jerusalem, teaching the disciples as he comes down what he is facing, that it will be in fact be his death, a message they do not want to hear, a message that they struggle with. According to the Gospel of John, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrives at Bethany, spends some time there, and apparently makes some advanced preparations. And then we have Palm Sunday, where Jesus has clearly orchestrated everything to send a message, getting on a donkey, riding down the Mount of Olives, entering the East Gate. All three, of course, fulfilling Scripture, all three sending a message to people that he is the expected Messiah. And they hear it, and they go nuts with the palm branches and the hosannas, and blessed is the coming kingdom of of David, evidently thinking that finally God's promises are coming true. And in their minds, this would mean that the oppressor, Rome, will be tossed out, and they will have a kingdom once again, and they will be restored to everything they had had in the past, but had lost centuries before. That day ends. Jesus is in the temple. It's late, and apparently he cannot do the final act he wanted to do. Monday, he comes back. He does the final act, which is a symbolic shutting down or destruction of the temple. Mark says that no one can take anything in or take anything out. We looked at the temple visually. There's a place that could literally happen. Jesus quotes 2 scriptures. One is that the temple was intended not just for the Jewish people, but for all people, hearkening all the way back to the call of Abraham, where God said to Abraham, I'm calling you that you may be a blessing to the nations. Being God's people is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. That is then picked up in Isaiah. Actually, it's picked up earlier than that when Solomon dedicates the temple, and the prayer of dedication gives thanks to God for the temple, and that the foreigner who comes will be able to bring their gift right up to God's altar. That message is again picked up in Isaiah. Israel is called to be a light to the nations. All of that belies what Israel has become in the first century, where the temple has become the ultimate symbol of exclusion, with level after level after level. So Jesus stands at the very center, just outside the temple building itself, but inside the complex, quoting 2 scriptures. One is that God intended this as a place for everyone, but it's become a place where most people are rejected. Secondly, he makes a reference to a den of thieves from Jeremiah, indicating probably it's not an attack on the temple itself, but on the temple leadership, the chief priests and the elders who run in collaboration with Rome, run the kingdom, run Jerusalem, and run the temple. He retires back to Bethany that night. On Tuesday, he comes in. For the 3rd day in a row, Jesus goes directly to the temple. This time, his enemies are ready, and there is a coordinated attack as the chief priests attack Jesus and then send other groups to do the same thing. And so they throw him some trick questions, things like, is it lawful to render unto Caesar? If a woman is married to 7 different men under the Levirate law, who does she belong to at the resurrection, and things like that. In every case, Jesus is able to turn them aside, and a couple of times go and attack. Finally, the scribe comes, apparently in sincerity, asking sort of the great question of the day. Of all the commandments, all the 613 plus the thousands of interpretations from the rabbis, what's the most important? Jesus says it's love God and love your neighbor, and the scribe agrees, and then the scribe answers with a bombshell. Rabbi, these 2, loving God and love your neighbor, are more important than anything that happens in the temple. And Jesus says to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. On Wednesday, Jesus stays in Bethany. And there we have the incident of the anointing of Jesus. There's different versions of it. Is this the head? Is it the feet? Kind of what does it mean? But the main story in Mark is basically the woman breaks a jar of nard. She simply pours it on him. Jesus then takes that act of kindness and gives it a new interpretation. He says that he's being anointed, which is messianic language associated with the Messiah, because in Hebrew the word Messiah literally means anointed. Anointed means Messiah. But he says, strangely, he's being anointed for his death. And it's there on that day, on Wednesday, on the anointing, that we begin to transition from Jesus as Messiah to what kind of Messiah he will be as he begins to talk about his death. On Thursday, Jesus sends people in again to prearrange things, and it appears that there's things prearranged before they prearrange. They go into town, they're to find a man, unusual, carrying a water jug, probably from the Essene community, and that person will lead them to a place where some preparations have already been made, and they are to make further preparations for Jesus to celebrate the Passover. That night, Jesus comes in with the rest of the disciples, and they celebrate what we today know as the Last Supper. But what it was is a Jewish Haggadah, a Passover service. That service retells the story of the Exodus and how God's people were slaves and how they cried out to God for deliverance. And as the scripture says, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, the God of Israel liberates them from the oppressor Pharaoh, and they move to freedom in the new land. Jesus takes the cup, he takes the bread, traditional images, he reinterprets those. They represent suffering in the past at the Exodus. Jesus reinterprets them for suffering that he will be going through on Friday, the night that we're covering today. So with that, we're then also told that Judas is now ready to betray Jesus. And then later that night, Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, which is an odd story because Jesus, for the first time, does not go back to Bethany where he's safe, but he stays literally right outside the city walls, just where it's so easy to get him. And we have the arrest there. He's then taken. And the rest of Mark's story that evening is Jesus goes through a trial of sorts, but it's before the high priest and probably his privy council, not the full Sanhedrin, but a smaller group. They are convinced that he has broken the law and that he is a threat, and at the end, the high priest says that Jesus has committed blasphemy because he says, I am, to the question, are you the Messiah? I am being an answer, but in Greek, it is also the exact word, I guess in English too, for the name of God. Mount Sinai, when Moses says, who shall I say sent me? God essentially says, I am sends you. And Jesus says, I am. So there's ambiguity there, but the high priest senses that. We ended last night with the high priest simply handing Jesus over to Pontius Pilate and to the authority of Rome, because under the Roman law, the Jews are no longer allowed to execute someone to do the death penalty. That is reserved for the occupying power of Rome. So for Jesus to die, they have to get Rome to do that work for them. So with that, we begin Good Friday. Now, we're going to look at 5 scenes. There's the trial before Pilate, and there's also kind of a side trial with Herod in the Gospel of Luke. So we're going to today do a little bit of moving back and forth between Gospels because there is some variation between the Gospels and some of them are important. So we'll do the trial before Pilate and before Herod Antipas. We'll look at the scene where Pilate offers them Barabbas and the crowd shouts, crucify him. We'll do the Via Dolorosa. The scriptural version, of course, is much shorter, but basically the path from where Jesus is condemned to where he's executed. The crucifixion story and the death and the burial story. We begin with Mark 15, 1-5, Jesus before Pilate. Apparently, Jesus has stayed in a cell overnight. As soon as it was morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes with the whole council. By the way, if you've been to Israel, if you've been to the Promised Land, One of the things you'll see is basically Caiaphas's house, and there is a tomb down there, first century, not tomb, a cell. It's almost like a tomb, where Jesus is traditionally held. And so this is the place where he would have held that night. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "You say so." Now, this issue of being king of the Jews is the only charge that interests Pilate. We looked at yesterday, there's a lot of different charges that come out against Jesus. There's actually 5 or 6. There's only as many as 3 in any one gospel, but blasphemy, threatening the temple, things like that. But Rome doesn't care about those things. Rome does not care about blasphemy. Rome does not care about the Jewish law. All they really care about is, are you a threat to the state? And being a king would be a threat to the states. It's the only one that's relevant. So as we roll forward, this is the one we see. Now, it's at this point that Luke adds a little story that we find only in Luke, that Herod is going to send Jesus over to the Jewish king up in Galilee, Herod Antipas, who will then send him back to Jesus. So for just a second, we're in Luke 23. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. Galileans have a very strong accent. Jesus had that accent. When he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, Herod is over Galilee and over Perea, where John the Baptist baptized. Pontius Pilate is over Judea and Jerusalem. When he heard that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. Herod questioned Jesus at some length. We know from earlier passages that Herod had been trying to get his hands on Jesus for some time, so finally he's done it. But Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by vehemently accusing him. So they're with Pilate, and now they follow Jesus over with Herod. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him, mocking him as a king, and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. A little parenthetical statement. Mark next tells us the story about the trial of Jesus and the Barabbas story and the cry of the crowd to crucify him. Now at the festival, Pilate used to release a prisoner for them, anyone whom they asked for. Now a man named Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. Rebels, insurrection, this is the language not of ordinary crime. These are crimes against Rome. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Let someone go. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man that you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But the crowd all the more shouted, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. After flogging Jesus, he handed Jesus over to be crucified. Now, there's several aspects of this story that we want to look at because it's historically very interesting, and it also has some controversies in it. Matthew's gospel tells us that the full name of this man was Jesus Barabbas, Jesus the son of Abbas. So the irony here is that in this scene, the crowd is going to make the choice between 2 Jesuses. Jesus, the King of the Jews, the Messiah, and Jesus, the rebel leader, the revolutionary. We're told that he's a revolutionary man who had participated in an insurrection. Now, historically, historians are a little bit bumfuzzled here because we know through Josephus and other sources, We know a lot about the first century. We know when the major insurrections were. Josephus, for example, just lays those out, multiple ones. This has led some scholars, and there's always a group of scholars, they're called minimalists, who say if we can't prove something, then it didn't happen. So this is one of those stories that has been kind of questioned. Is this just a literary deal that, for dramatic effect, the author made up? Scholars say, though, if you look at the story, it really is historically plausible, and there's some good reasons for it. For one thing, if there were a minor insurrection of an individual or an individual act of rebellion, either one of those things would not have made it in Josephus. And those things happened a lot. Major rebellions, major revolts where thousands of people die. Yes, Josephus does those. But small little acts, those happen literally every day, and they would not make it into the writing. Now, releasing Barabbas, this is a practice, again, that some people have kind of wondered about, but this is actually a documented practice of the Roman Empire. So I thought it might be worthwhile to kind of look at this. Josephus and the Roman historian Livy, both of them tell us, among others. For example, I'm going to give you two. One striking parallel is found in an ancient document. This is actually a document of a Roman governor and how a Roman governor treated a prisoner, and it's contemporary with the treatment of Jesus, except it happens to be over in Egypt, in a different area. It narrates a similar incident that happened. Egypt's occupied by Rome. Again, it's roughly the same time, within a few years. It's called the Florence Papyrus 61 because that's where it's found. And a part of that is the king says to the accused, "You are worthy of scourging, but I give you to the crowds." In other words, saying your fate will be decided by the crowds. Josephus narrates a story about a Roman governor, Albinus, who actually is in Palestine. Just a little bit time frame shift, but not much, indicating that Roman governors would take bribes either to set a convict free or to put a convict to death, depending on who the highest bidder was. Josephus says this: the governor was desirous to appeal to do something that might be grateful to the people of Jerusalem. So he brought out all those prisoners who seemed to him to be most plainly worthy of death and ordered them to be put to death. But as to those who had been put into prison for some trifling occasions, he took money for them and dismissed them. By which means the prisons were indeed emptied, and the country was filled with robbers. So Josephus is telling one of the possibilities here is if the right people grazed his palm with the right amount of money, justice could be flexible. An innocent man could die and a guilty man could go forward. So the story of Barabbas is in fact historically plausible by Roman standards. This kind of thing would have come as no surprise, that you would have a crowd shout for someone and you would release someone and you would condemn someone. The question, though, really is whether or not this is something Pilate would do. Now, Pilate is one of those characters that we actually know a lot about historically. He was known for being particularly brutal, even by Roman standards, and that says a lot. Later, he was removed from his office in Jerusalem on the charge of excessive brutality. Imagine that, a Roman being held accountable for excessive brutality. Josephus, again, records the story, so I thought you might enjoy this. This had to do with an incident that happened in Samaria, just a little bit of ways. The Samaritan Senate sent out an embassy to Vitellius. Now, Vitellius is up in Syria, and he's the governor who's over the governor, Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate answers to Valenius, and they all answer to Rome. The Samaritan Senate sent an embassy to the governor over Pontius Pilate and accused Pilate of the murder of those that were killed. There was an incident, and Pilate crushed it brutally, and lots of people died, and now a complaint has been filed. Because the Samaritans had not gone to Tarataba in order to revolt from the Romans, but to escape the violence of Pilate. So apparently Pilate had done something, some people tried to get away, and he did something else that led to a lot of deaths. So Vitellius ordered Pilate to go to Rome. to answer before the governor the accusation of the Jews. So this, Pilate is not a mamby-pamby guy. He's not a guy that's easily swayed. He's a brutal. He was a general in Germany before he became, the proconsul there in Jerusalem. The question is whether Pilate was more likely to release a revolutionary who had revolted against Rome to placate the crowd, that would be Barabbas, or whether he was to kill a, quote, revolutionary to subdue the crowd, which would be Jesus of Nazareth. Historically, Pilate would only have released someone who had committed murder during insurrection against Rome and condemned Jesus of Nazareth under some very specific circumstances. He had to have a really good reason for doing it. For example, if it were to placate his political allies, the temple authorities, whom he relied on to cooperate with, to run the country and to keep the peace and to keep the taxes flowing to Jerusalem, he could have done that. There is no way, given everything we know about Pilate, that he would have ever done this to placate the mob of common, ordinary Jews. Pontius Pilate giving in to the mob of common people makes no sense. We know a lot about him, and it just makes no sense. Everything we know about Pilate said that he would never have done that. Nor does it make sense that the crowd, in the ordinary sense that we've been using the word all week, would cry out, "Crucify him," if the crowd is the common people. Again, that makes no sense. Mark's gospel has told us that the people welcomed Jesus on Sunday. All week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they repeatedly have protected him from arrest. We're told that they would riot if anyone ever made a move against Jesus. So Jesus is literally protected by the crowd of the common people. We've looked at this once before, but it's worth looking at again. Josephus, the first century Jewish writer, has a place he confirms this. When Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified, this is the event that we're talking about right now, on Good Friday. When Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. So Josephus confirms that the common people never forsook Jesus. Now, in the story that we're looking at, the crowd has traditionally been understood as the ordinary common Jewish people. But this kind of runs against everything we've been seeing so far in the week. So, is the crowd that fickle? Did the crowd that shouts Hosanna and the crowd that protects Jesus on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, does that crowd suddenly turn on Jesus? Depictions in art, and this is one of them, typically show thousands of the common people before Pontius Pilate and their crowd shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Of course, this is one of the places we get this horrendous imagery of the Jews as the Christ killers and the Jews as the enemy God that then plays forward through history and anti-Semitism. Now, historically, here's what contemporary scholars say. And this is fairly recent kind of awareness that we've started embraced. It is much more likely that the crowd is actually a much smaller group made up of a much different group of people. And it turns out that we actually have multiple sources of evidence that confirm this. And that this crowd would not be the common people. This crowd would be the temple authorities and their supporters. And there were supporters they had in town. If you just look at the Gospels themselves, both Mark and John support this. Both Gospels tell us that these events are taking place inside Pilate's headquarters. There's a model of that. Now, this is where Pontius Pilate is protected. It was actually built by Herod. If you see here, there's an outer wall that's fortified. This is where Pilate is, and some of his soldiers are here. All of his functionaries are here. This is where he's kind of running the government and stuff. It's a great place to be. It's, given if you can't be at Caesarea Maritima over on the coast of the Mediterranean. You want to be with all the amenities. Here's the thing about this. This is not a place that the common people will ever see in their lives. This is like saying that the common people are just going to stroll into Buckingham Palace. It's not going to happen. If Pilate has to address the common people, he will do that somewhere else. This is his inner sanctum, inside his headquarters. So this is what John says. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It's inside this building. Mark confirms it. After flogging Jesus, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers led Jesus out into the courtyard of the palace. Just in case we're not clear about this, that is the governor's headquarters. So the scene with Barabbas does not take place anywhere that common people can be, but it takes place inside the palace itself. The crowd of ordinary Jews would never have been allowed in this. It would not be safe. The Jews rioted all the time, slightest provocation. Are you going to allow a mob into your inner sanctum where they could do you damage? No. Every historian worth their salt says there's no way that would happen. But a crowd of the high priests and the elders and the supporters of Rome and the collaborators of Rome and the people that Pontius Pilate works with and depends on, that crowd could be there. As well as they may have some additional supporters because there were people. But for the most part, these are going to be upper echelon, the wealthy, the ruling class. They have access to him. That the crowd, this crowd, would shout, "Crucify him," makes absolute total sense. After all, what have they been trying to do for the last 6 days? When Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, we already know that they're seeking to have him killed. And every day that is repeated again and again. This group perceives Jesus to be a threat. This group seeks to eliminate Jesus. This group seeks his death. And now this group is going to be inside the palace as Jesus is brought forward. John gives us a chilling detail. They cried out, away with him, crucify him." And here's the chilling part. Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Think about that. The leaders of the Jewish temple and the Jewish nation, we have no king but Caesar. Now, the irony is chilling. We may not be familiar with this, but if you can go online and do this, if you go online and get the Passover Haggadah, the Passover service, this is still true. Because at Passover, a holiday that celebrates Israel's God as the only true king, the Haggadah begins with these words: "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, Melech, King of the universe." So here they are on the Passover that celebrates God as king, saying we have no king but Caesar. It's just like the Roman coin. They're letting it be known who they are. Now Mark turns to what happens to Jesus between his being condemned and his being crucified. That has come to be known as, over the centuries, as the Via Dolorosa, the path or the way or the road of sorrows. Also called the Stations of the Cross. So if you go to Jerusalem, you can do that, or if you go like into Cox Chapel, around this time you do that. Of course, we can't get in there right now, but that's a different story. And the soldiers clothed him with a purple cloak. Purple is the color of royalty. So this is mocking. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. Again, mockery, mockery, mockery. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Now, this scene is so graphic and so specific that some have wondered again, is this plausible? I mean, Could soldiers have actually done something like that? Well, there's several really good solid reasons to believe that this is likely to be a very historical depiction. First of all, it mimics a Roman triumph, whereby Caesar is held king and emperor and given homage. We know that this kind of mimicking and mocking was common practice, particularly when someone aspired to be king. We have multiple examples of this. Uh, One is from the contemporary Jewish author Philo. Now, he's a contemporary of Josephus, but Josephus was in Palestine and Philo was in Alexandria, Egypt, the largest Jewish community in the world. This is the story of Barabbas. It's several slides, but I think it's worth seeing. Barabbas has been arrested because he was a messianic figure. From the Roman perspective, a pretender to kinghood. Then driving the poor rich as far as the public gymnasium, they set him up on high that he might be seen by everybody. They flattened out a leaf of papyrus and put it on his head instead of a crown. They clothed the rest of his body with a common doormat instead of a cloak. Instead of a scepter, they put in his hand a small stick of the native papyrus. And when he'd received all the insignia of royal authority and had been dressed and adorned like a king, the young men put sticks on their shoulders and stood on each side of him like spear bearers in imitation of the bodyguards of the king. Then others came up, some as if to salute him, others making though as they wished to plead their causes before him like a king, and others pretending to wish to consult with him about the affairs of state. Then, from the multitude of those who were standing around, there arose a wonderful shout of men calling out, Marius, Marius. Marius is the name by which they call the kings among the Syrians. Very plausible. The one that Philo talks about is exactly what happened to Jesus, but actually it is even a more elaborate mockery. Now, the soldiers could be mocking Jesus as a pretender, to be a king Messiah, but they might also be mocking his entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, where Jesus was hailed as king to the crowds. Jesus' entry could easily have been seen by the Romans as mocking Pilate and Pilate's entry in Jerusalem, and this could be their payback to Jesus. Mark then turns to the story of Simon of Cyrene. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, which is in North Africa, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Odd detail. Now, there's a historical note here. Mark gives us the names of two of Simon's sons, and it makes no sense because you don't do this. I mean, we don't do this in the other story. There's no reason to put that little detail there unless these people are actually known by Mark's congregation. So it's just like the little detail of the man whose clothing was ripped off and he ran away naked. This is another one of those instances where scholars think, this may be a little reference of eyewitness detail that kind of came to Mark. And Mark is also, perhaps, if these two are still alive, which it indicates kind of they are, that he might be giving acknowledgement to the fact that these are the sons of the guy he's got that from. That's conjecture, we don't know. Now, an early 2nd century source gives us a little inside information here. It tells us that the Gospel of Mark was apparently, as one of its resources, drawn on material from Peter, the apostle of Jesus. About 120, Papias, up in Asia Minor, kind of where Paul had been active, writes this. He writes this about a lot of authors, but this is what he has to say about Mark. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, this would be the John Mark in the book of Acts, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered. He took special care not to omit anything he had heard and not to put anything fictitious into his statement. So very meticulous, kind of professional note-taking. Mark now turns to crucifixion. Then they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews," or in other sources, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Now, crucifixion literally means staked or fixed, like nailing you or tying you to a cross. Turns out the Romans did not invent this. It goes back many hundreds of years earlier. It goes back to the Persians 500-600 years before Jesus. In the Roman times, crucifixion was a form of political terrorism. The purpose was to deter rebellion. Most people were not crucified. Matter of fact, crucifixion was reserved for people who were terrorists, rebels, those who threatened the authority of Rome, and for slaves. Others were just summarily killed. The point here is that you want to have a long, protracted, suffering death to make a point. This was reinforced by having the crucifixions outside the city or on the road into the city. This is the model of Jerusalem. That road at the bottom there on the left-hand side is the road that Pontius Pilate would have come up from the Mediterranean Sea, from Caesarea Maritima. On the right hand there, you can see an artist's depiction of the palace that Pontius Pilate is residing in. And of course, the temple is in the background. On the far left side of the temple is, you can see a little structure there, and that's the Antonia fortress where most of the soldiers are to be there in case something breaks out. What's interesting is that by Roman tradition, the crucifixion would have taken place on the main road into the city, from whatever the main city was, just before you get to the gate. And that's where the red circle is. Here's the interesting footnote. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in exactly where that red circle is. Today, this is far inside the city. In the first century, it was outside the city walls. But there was, in fact, there a rock quarry, and there's a place there where Rome crucified. Another interesting thing about the Via Dolorosa is that historically we've changed our understanding of some stuff. If you look at the more towards the top where the temple is, on the far left, that's the Antonia fortress. People used to think that Jesus was actually tried in the Antonia fortress, and then you would be led through the streets of Jerusalem over to where the red circle is to be crucified. So the journey from the Antonia fortress to where the red circle is, that would be the traditional Via Dolorosa, the walk where the Stations of the Cross are. Now, that was 2,000 years ago, and that's 70 feet below where the current streets are, none of the streets of the seven. So the walk you take is actually symbolic. What scholars now believe firmly is that Jesus was not tried in the Antonia fortress. What we learned from Mark, what we learned from John, would be the palace. And that is the palace that Herod built and the one that Pontius Pilate resides in. So it's right there. So actually the Via Dolorosa, historically, scholars think, would have been a much shorter walk. You simply walk outside the palace, you cross the road, and you go over to the crucifixion site. But today, the Via Dolorosa that you walk basically just commemorates the events of the story within the Gospels. So it's as good as any. And it's one that's been used for well over 1,000 years. In Mark, everyone mocks Jesus, including those who are crucified with him. But this is one of those places where we need to look at the other Gospels and compare. Because in Luke, one of those crucified does mock Jesus, one does not. And that is the one you've all heard maybe called the good thief. You know, one says, if you're the Son of God, get down off this cross. And that's the mocking. The other one says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. That's only in Luke. Matthew adds the little footnote that those crucified with Jesus were bandits, not thieves. And the word he uses is a very loaded word. It's lestes. Literally, it means insurrectionist, rebel, or revolutionary. It's not a thief in the sense that they're out there stealing private property. You don't get crucified for that. You just get summarily killed or thrown in prison. Now, lestes means someone who's rebelled against Rome or has perceived to be a threat against Rome. Barabbas is a lestes. The two thieves are not thieves, they're lestes. Jesus is a lestes. All three crucified that day, and Barabbas, all four, were perceived as threats to Rome. Now, this is confirmed by a little historical note, by the charge that is placed over the head of Jesus on the cross. It's written in 3 languages. Rome did this. We're going to see some examples in just a minute, but here was the practice. Political terrorism. You crucify a person on the main road right out the city. Everybody's going to walk by and see him, and you leave them there basically to rot. And above them is the sign, and basically says, this is what the person did. And the point being, don't even think about it unless you want the same kind of thing. And Jesus is crucified under the charge of King of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, that he pretended to be, or that he claimed to be, a king of the Jewish people that Rome could not tolerate. The early Christian writer Eusebius, who was living in the time of Constantine and was the historian for Constantine, had access to a lot of earlier sources, but he attests to the Roman practice of having the convicted criminal wear their name and the criminal charge around their neck as they were led through town, and of course that would be nailed above the cross just to make the point. He tells the story of one Attalus, who was a Christian. Attalus was led around the amphitheater, and a placard was carried before him on which was written in Latin, "This is Attalus the Christian." And when he's executed, that is put above him. Now it's interesting, King of the Jews is not a title that originates in Christian circles. Neither Jesus nor the early Christians ever appear to have used this title. This is a Roman language because it's the kind of thing they care about. It indicates that Romans saw Jesus as a political threat, not a religious threat, and that he's executed for precisely that reason. We now have Jesus's cry from the cross, or if you combine all 4 Gospels, you get what are called the 7 last words of Christ. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, so for 3 hours. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, this cry fits Mark's theology because in Mark, Jesus is the suffering servant. And Mark adds a lot of details. For example, the Garden of Gethsemane, that drops like drops of blood came off his forehead as he prayed. And so Mark very much has this kind of a tone. No other gospel writer does. As a matter of fact, this Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani is not found in Luke, and it's not found in Matthew, which is interesting, since both Matthew and Luke copy Mark and add stuff to it, and yes, remove stuff. That's too human of Jesus, so they can't have that. But the cry shouldn't be removed because it's actually a quotation from Psalm 22. And the psalm then ends in a way that I think Mark intended. It's a psalm that the gospel writers will repeatedly turn to, just like Isaiah 53 and 54. These are scriptures that are used to interpret the meaning of Jesus' death. The psalm, which starts out, my God, why are you forsaken me? Why are you so far to me? When I cry out to you, why can't I sense you and experience you?" And it's very human anguish. The psalm then develops into one, well, I'm praying to God, and then the psalm ends with this. "For God did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard me when I cry." So Mark is probably intending the psalm to be the human cry of affliction, but also an affirmation that God hears prayers. And for Matthew and Luke to remove it, you lose that. Jesus' cry varies within each gospel. So let's just look at that for a second. In Matthew and Mark, I guess actually Matthew does keep it. My God, why have you forsaken me? Luke has three cries. Today you'll be with me in paradise. That's the one to the good thief. Father, forgive them, for they know what they do. And then finally he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. John also has three cries. One where Jesus says to John standing down below, John, behold your mother, and to his mother, mother, behold your son. Sort of transferring the responsibility of taking care of his mother, which he has as the oldest son, to someone who can do that. The very human cry, I thirst, is found in John. And then John concludes with teleeste, it is finished. These have become known as the 7 last words together. Next, Mark will narrate the death of Jesus. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the tearing of the curtain is a highly symbolic image and probably has two meanings. One, if you think about the function of the temple separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. No one had access to that except the high priest once a year, and each high priest only served once. So it was a symbol of separation from God. Of all those walls we've been seeing in the temple, this was the final one that came right out. So if you rip the temple, or the curtain, one of the messages is, well, we're no longer separated from God. We have access to God. It may also mean that the temple is no longer needed. In other words, it's symbolically destroyed, just as Jesus talked about on Sunday morning, or actually on Monday. The Roman centurion. Now, when the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw that he had breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. Now, I want to look at that because it's probably what Mark intends to be the climactic statement. A Roman centurion, an officer over 100 soldiers, probably in charge of the crucifixion, proclaims Jesus to be Son of God. In Latin, you're assuming that's what he's speaking, he cries that Jesus is Divi Filius, the Son of God. This is the title of Caesar on the Roman coins, if you remember from Wednesday. And Mark, Rome testifies against itself. The man dying on the cross, the man who is killed by Rome, a Roman centurion says, is the true Son of God, not the one sitting on the throne of Rome. Political polemic. In Luke, the centurion pronounces Jesus' innocence. In Matthew, the dead come out of the tombs and are seen, very dramatic scene. In John, there are no supernatural events at Jesus' death, which might be a surprise. John seems satisfied with only teleeste. It is finished. Now, we looked at it earlier, but it's at this point that Mark throws in what's sometimes called the Mark and Bombshell. Mark, having traveled 15 chapters of a 16-chapter gospel, never having once mentioned that there's any women anywhere near the ministry of Jesus, suddenly says this. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, the younger, and of Joses, and Salome, not the Salome who danced for John's head, the different Salome. These women used to follow Jesus, and they provided for him out of their funds when he was in Galilee. They financed his ministry. And there were many other women, in addition to these three, who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So from Galilee, you think in the map, you go down from Galilee to Jerusalem, except Jerusalem is uphill. It's the top of a mountain, so you literally go up to Jerusalem. Now, in the Mark and Thunderclap, women had been with Jesus from the beginning, but they'd been off stage. So now we go to the burial. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, so we're in the middle of both the Passover and now it's the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, of the Sanhedrin, of the ruling group, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. That's disciple language. Went boldly to Pilate. Now, he's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's a leading Jew. He's a member of the aristocracy. He has access to Pilate. Boldly, Pilate asked for the body of Jesus. When Pilate learned from the centurion that Jesus was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph brought a linen cloth, taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, who we've not heard of any time before this point, is an interesting character. Mark tells us he's a respected member of the council. He's one of the chief priests and the elders that we've been hearing about all week, except this one is not an enemy of Jesus and apparently is a supporter of Jesus. We're told that he's expectantly waiting for the kingdom. That's a strong hint that Joseph is a follower of Jesus, but probably in the closet, not being public about that for political reasons. Matthew also makes it explicit that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus and that the tomb was Joseph. So Matthew gives us some extra details. John tells us that Joseph is a disciple of Jesus, but that he was a secret disciple. And then John adds that the tomb is new, and he adds Nicodemus to the scene. And Nicodemus is again a fascinating. You may remember back in John 2, this is Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, a leader of the Jews, comes to Jesus by night, and Jesus says to him, you must be born again. A little bit later in chapter 7, we're told that Nicodemus, the same Nicodemus, is a member of the Sanhedrin. So Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, both among the ruling elites of Jerusalem. Now, in recent books and a couple of TV shows, there's been a lot of brouhaha about was Jesus buried or not. So I thought this is worth looking at. Some commentators suggest that Jesus' body was not buried. That his body was simply left to rot or left to be eaten by scavengers. And here's the argument. This was the normal practice of Romans with crucified criminals. The normal practice is you did not take the body down. You left it there for weeks, for months, for however long. And so that billboard about what happens to you if you oppose Rome just got more and more graphic by the day. As evidence, it's pointed out that only one skeleton of a crucified man has ever been discovered. So only once have we found a tomb with a buried body. And you may have seen this picture that through the man's heel, there was a spike-driven metal spike. And because it had been bent, they could not get it out of the bone because that was valuable metal, and they left it. So the evidence being cited is, well, out of all the thousands and thousands of people who have been crucified, only one was ever found that we knew that was buried. Now, leaving bodies on a cross to rot or be eaten by a scavenger is, again, part of the deterrent to crucifixion. The question, though, is whether the burial of Jesus is historically plausible. Again, the evidence says it is plausible for multiple reasons. We have multiple witnesses who confirm that Rome adapted its policy of letting the person rot on the cross to accommodate Jewish law and Jewish sensibilities. So, for example, once again, the Jewish author Josephus comes in with this. Jews are so careful about funeral rites that even criminals who have been sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset. So the practice is being done. In addition, both Josephus and Philo confirm that the Romans acquiesced to the Jewish custom, and the reason that's given is, well, we want to keep the peace. We don't want to give reason for a rite. Roman law specifically states that bodies will be given to relatives when requested. And this is even written into the Roman law code. The Roman Digesta, which dates from the time of Augustus Caesar, has a lot of things in it. This is one of the things that's in there. The bodies of those condemned to death should not be refused their relatives. And the divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. The bodies of persons who had been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission is granted. That's from the Digesta, chapter 48. By Roman law, the body of a condemned criminal could be buried if requested. And if a leader of the Sanhedrin, a leader of the Jewish people, Joseph of Arimathea, requested it, it would be a legitimate request and would have been granted. Now, whose tomb? Matthew mentions that it's Josephus's tomb. Well, that can mean several different things. The other Gospels only mention that it's a tomb or that it's a new tomb. The Mishnah may give us some additional insights here, because the Mishnah, again, is that body of Jewish material just post-biblical, but 1st century BC, 1st century time of Jesus, and a little bit beyond that. The Jewish law states that the body of a condemned criminal could not be buried in the tomb of their own family. The Mishnah tells us that 2 places outside Jerusalem were reserved for convicted and executed criminals and was set aside for them. Here's 2 quotes. The first is from Shemhat. But there are 2 graveyards, this is in Jerusalem, there are 2 graveyards made ready for the use of the court for the burial of criminals. They did not bury the felon in the burial grounds of his ancestors with his family, but in the court's tomb. So the court has access to tombs. It's possible, we don't know this for a fact, but it's possible that one of these court tombs is the tomb that Joseph of Arimathea used, because as a member of the council, he would have had access to those tombs. Jesus is laid in the tomb late Friday afternoon. The Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday and lasts through Saturday, or really effectively until Sunday morning. The next time anyone will have a chance to even check on the tomb will be on Sunday morning. It's only then, on Sunday, Easter morning, that what all of this means is going to slowly begin to make sense and become clear.